Trump administration State Department is officially no longer reporting on women's human rights violations across the world, and it is a signal as to what is to come in terms of women's rights on U.S. soil. These are the State Department human rights reports. They have been being published since the 70s. You can go on the State Department website, you can pick any country you want, and you can look at an overview of their human rights practices in the last year. Historically, there's been a section on women that may, among other things, talk about domestic and sexual violence, femicide, child brides, sex trafficking, reproductive rights violations, all types of gendered human rights violations that typically happen to women for being women. That section doesn't exist anymore. The Trump administration cut it, and at the outset, it is the Trump administration demonstrating that it does not view women's rights as human rights, right? Because if so, gendered violence and human rights violations against women would make it in the human rights reports. It's also a signal of what's to come for women's rights in the US, okay? I've been writing about this since 2020. So this is an article that I wrote in 2020 when the Trump administration cut the section on reproductive rights violations. And I was predicting that it was doing so because it intended to commit those human rights violations on US soil. So like, countries don't typically like to call out other countries' human rights violations when it is either doing or intends to do the exact same thing to its own citizens, right? So for example, they stopped reporting on nations that were imprisoning women for having miscarriages, claiming that they had abortions, and I predicted that it was because the US was intending to do that to its own citizens. I believe that the same thing is happening now. There are catastrophic efforts to take away women's rights in the U.S. Women in the U.S. no longer have control over their futures and their reproduction. Just last week, the U.S. Secretary of Defense endorsed an extremist group calling for an end to women's right to vote. I am not surprised that they are now no longer reporting on women's human rights violations because they do not want to condemn other nations for what they intend to do here.